Hi, my name is Jackie Shelton. I am the chair of the Northern Nevada Marches Forward. We were originally, this is the offshoot of the Reno Women's March. And what we found over 5 years of doing this is we had very important conversations happening, but 3 minutes is not nearly long enough to be able to address these. So we started having these on a monthly basis. 45 minutes is also not long enough, but it's a chance for us to all get a little bit of an education on important issues that are affecting people a lot of times who are different from us. And so it's not easy to understand what is happening. And so I'm really grateful to the people who've come together today and on all of our presentations to educate us. Tonight we have Beverly Harry, who's a member of the Northern Nevada Marches Forward Board of Directors, who's brought together this amazing group of panelists today, and she will take it away from here. Thank you, Beverly.
Hi, hi everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion on gender-based violence. This will be a hard conversation, but given the current political climate, we think it's an important conversation to have to talk about the ways our communities are facing violence and how we can show up to support them. And my name is Beverly Harry. I am Navajo, full Navajo, and I am a Native organizer with PLAN, the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada. I want to add that Indigenous, BIPOC, and LGBTQ people are often targeted for violence at higher rates than any other communities. In this forum, we'll consider the human rights violations related to social, economic, race, and cultural differences. From a personal perspective, I know that Indigenous women are 10 times more likely to be killed than any other race of women, and is the third leading cause of death among these women. My aim is to bring more awareness and community healing on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, relatives, and Two-Spirit and trans people. Today's conversation will also look at how crimes have exploited, killed, and caused missing relatives, which are directly related to gender-based violence. At the end of our session, we will share action items that folks can all help to all take to help protect and support our communities and the different groups of people that are out there within cities and states and across borders. Today, I will also provide a land acknowledgement, and I understand that it's not appropriate for a land acknowledgement to begin given if we don't request land back for our Indigenous people. It is our responsibility to honor Indigenous peoples of the Great Basin. In the South, we honor the Southern Paiutes by their name, the Nuwuvi. In the North, from Pyramid Lake to the Mojave Desert, the Numu. Northern Paiutes take pride with the pupfish, the trout, and the kuyui. Extending from Death Valley to the Ruby Mountains and beyond are ancestral lands of the Western Shoshone and Goshutes. Throughout the high desert to the alpine areas of Tahoe, the Washoe story centers around their beautiful lake. All Indigenous peoples have place names that were trade routes and areas dedicated for gathering, hunting, and healing. Indigenous peoples continue to honor songs and prayers that bring a balance and an indebtedness to protecting the lands, wildlife, and waters against sickness. We honor Indigenous teachings and the continued protection we seek for our Earth Mother. With the land acknowledgement, we also ask for reparations, and we also understand the need to protect these lands for the next 7 generations. So we have work to do on this. For tonight's conversation, we thank you again for joining us. We will be joined by some amazing panelists who will introduce themselves a little bit later to help represent some of the communities facing gender-based violence it is important for tonight's conversation that we work on violence prevention. And it is so needed, like right now, especially within our intergovernmental relations, requesting additional funding. Where is that money going to come from? And advocate for solutions to the problems with policy changes at both state and federal level. Our attention is also on a couple of large pieces connecting our solidarity with Black women and women of color who live south of the medicine line. This issue is an epidemic that we face as marginalized communities, and that make up the people that are facing the violence with missing and murdered Indigenous people. And I want to make sure that we're working on this epidemic, which requires a commitment from governments, law enforcement, social justice organizations, mining justice organizations, and VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women Act advocates and land and water protectors. With that, I will pass it to our amazing panelists so they can introduce themselves and share with us why this conversation is so important to you and the communities you belong to. So the panelists will share their name and their pronouns.
I think I'm the first one. My name is Laura Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada and Plan Action. I am coming to you all from Piscataway land, also known as Washington, D.C. And I'm happy to see everyone here, and I will pass it to the next.
My name is Alastair Bitsóí. I'm Diné from the Navajo Nation in the New Mexico side of the Navajo Nation. That's where I'm from originally. Currently based in, I guess, St. George and Salt Lake City. So like Paiute lands and in Shoshone and Goshute lands. And I'm also the Salt Lake Tribune Southern Utah reporter. So I cover various different topics that are also on tonight's panel. And it's just a pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you, Alastair. I will go next. I think I'm next. My name is Margarita Tobon. My pronouns are she, they. I am a settler on Northern Paiute land, also known as Reno. And I am a community organizer and activist. You'll probably see me around, but today I'm here standing as a queer Latina who is fighting to end violence in our communities. And I will pass it on over to Erika.
Thank you so much. Hi, y'all. My name is Erika Castro. I'm the organizing director with Plan here in Las Vegas, which is actually Newuvi land. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I'll pass it back to Bev.
Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. I really appreciate it. I also want to acknowledge our executive director from the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, Laura Martin. She's been traveling for the last couple of weeks, working on many different strategies to build a stronger plan organization for us and helping push up people and planet first. And so the first part of the conversation, I will turn it to Laura Martin to answer a question that I have for her. So the violence against Black women has been part of American history. And I understand that history really, really well with Indigenous people, but through slavery and Jim Crow policies, there's been a lot of different areas of violence that we can talk about. But currently, you know, across the US, homicides have increased by 30% between 2019 and 2020, which is the largest single year jump in 60 years. So, Laura, can you shed light on the history of violence against Black women and how it's showing up now?
Sure. Thank you, Beverly, for teeing up that question. And I apologize if I forgot to say my pronouns are she and her. And so, yeah, Beverly kind of touched on the history going back to enslaved Africans being brought here against their will, and free labor extracted from them, their children extracted from them, even, you know, their very breast milk extracted for them. And in having this conversation, I also want to recognize that there are probably people on the call or who will watch the recording later who this could be very triggering. This is a tough conversation to have, but it's an important conversation to have as we are organizers in our community, to recognize not only our history, but maybe even check our own biases and also educate, you know, the next generation of Nevadans so they are empowered with this knowledge and can commit to being, doing and being better. That history of violence has created the assumption that Black women can't feel pain. One of the greatest examples of that, and I want to get his name right, is Dr. J. Marion Sims. He is considered the father of gynecology. He came up with a lot of medical practices in women's reproductive systems, and he fine-tuned his craft by performing his, I guess you can call them experiments on Black women against their will and without anesthesia. And unfortunately, that type of medical racism persists, as even today, Black women deal with doctors who feel that their pain tolerance is higher than that of white women. And that is why Black women's infant mortality rate is also so high. Even wealthy women like Serena Williams, one of the best athletes in the world, almost died after giving birth to her daughter because her doctors were not responding to her needs to address the pain that she was feeling, which was actually a blood clot after she was giving birth. And so, you know, going back from Middle Passage through Jim Crow, through segregation, through all of this, there's this idea that Black women can't feel pain, and it shows up today through violence. And I also wanted to make sure I also lift it up. You know, 2021 was the deadliest year for trans people. There were 45 incidents of trans people being murdered. Over a quarter of those people were murdered inside of their own homes. And 75% of those trans folks were Black. Many of them were sex workers earning money for survival, or regardless of what their occupation was or what they did to survive, we should all be asking ourselves why. Why is it trans Black women who are more likely to be killed, especially in their own home? And we have to wonder if it is tied back to just over history, how we have seen, you know, Black women is not necessarily human, but as someone who can endure great pain.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for answering that question. And you know, I have to admit that there's you know, times when I learned so much just from the people that I work with, and also having those moments where I see these connections coming together, and it's really important to have these discussions. And so the the following question is the one that is similar, but it's talking about the history of violence towards Black women and the violence that we're seeing with MMIW and or the overturn of Roe versus Wade. How are those all related?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and a conversation I want to continue to have. I am really committed to ensuring that we're building bridges between Indigenous and Black communities. throughout history. There's a lot of parallels to our struggle, the extraction of labor, forced removal, genocide, violence against women's bodies as a tool of war. It's something both of our people have experienced, and we share so much in common. I do think that as Beverly and I have had conversations, I also feel that my culture, Black people also, while being pro-choice, are also unashamed to say that we feel we are also life givers or bearers of life, and that could be our own children, or it could be plants, animals, the way we give back to the earth as much as we take from it. And I think that the policy, the draft opinion that the Supreme Court wrote really just shows a disregard for women in many ways and goes deeper into attacking our privacy rights. That opinion also referenced, it basically said, Roe versus Wade shouldn't be protected because it didn't always exist. And the examples that were used were things like Plessy versus Ferguson, or even anti-miscegenation laws. If Loving v. Virginia never passed, I would not be alive. I have two parents that are different ethnicities. And so we should all be worried about that. And again, that also affects Native people. It's interesting how there's this huge uproar about protecting life and the sanctity of life, but where are those people when Amanda and Ezra were taken from us? Where are those people when we're discovering the little bodies of kids buried at boarding school? Where are the pro-life people when we're trying to protect the ancestors at Pahimahal so they aren't desecrated for the sake of someone's electric car? So it's very interesting that people who care about life seem to only care about fetal tissue and not people's lives who are harmed every day in very, very cruel ways. And we have to wear those scars for generations. And unfortunately, the pro-life groups have shown no interest in supporting us.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you for that last piece. Lastly, I wanted see if you can share also how the Black Lives Matter movement has supported Black women and their fight to end violence within violence against the Black community. How do you think that will happen?
So definitely, I've met my colleague Leslie Turner when she was organizing a rally to avenge the death of Trayvon Martin, which I believe was 2014. And we were lucky to become co-workers at Plan, and now she's running her own organization, Mass Liberation. And I've been able to work closely with her to bail folks out. And, I think somebody said, close to the majority of people in Clark County are women, and many of those are Black women head of households who have been taken away from their children because of parking tickets, jaywalking, even women who are defending themselves against an abusive partner end up jailed. We've seen that happen too many times. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is a movement for liberation and to ensure that our communities can thrive in dignity. We can raise our families to full term, meaning our kids aren't being killed by police or in any other type of violence, that our kids are able to reach their full potential. And I know that we share that with the Indigenous community. And I'm going to keep bringing that up because, even Indigenous communities, very rural, many of the Black communities in Nevada are very urban in more densely populated areas. There's just so much that we share because we know, like around areas like Schurz, Nevada, we've also bailed out people who are Indigenous. So they're also suffering from over incarceration and not enough love and support that families need to be able to just live in peace. And so I'm really happy about the Black Lives Matter movement, and also the solidarity is shown across the country with Indigenous folks. And I also just want to lift up that the leaders and founders of the Black Lives Matter movement are queer Black women. And so I think it's important to say that I'm happy that the Black community really allowed them space to lead, because when we say Black Lives Matter, we definitely mean all Black lives, so trans, queer, all of the above, because at the end of the day, this is our community, we belong here, and we belong and should be able to live here safely.
Wow. Well, that is really, really amazing. Thank you, Laura, for your great leadership in building community and developing the leadership for mass liberation across Nevada. So now we're going to go ahead and shift over to the issue of MMIP and the LGBTQ issue with our friend Alastair Bitsóí. Good evening, Alastair. Hey, so nice to see you. Can you please introduce yourself and your affiliation with MMIP in Utah?
Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for inviting me onto this panel. Just to follow up on Laura, I forgot to identify my pronouns. I just go by he, him. And so that's how I would be identified for now, at least for the sake of this panel. And I just wanted to introduce myself. I am Dene from the Navajo Nation. As indicated, I'm also the Salt Lake Tribune Southern Utah reporter. So I'm basically on the way, I guess, is it northeast edge with the Nevada border, near St. George in Arizona. And when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous persons, or missing and murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Day, plus, at least in Utah, it's +2 spirit LGBTQ. It's different meanings, I think, from different regions of America. Like I know in Utah, they've acknowledged it as MMIG plus LGBTQ Day. There's a task force there. I guess across America, it's Indigenous MIPP Day. There's also MMI Indigenous Relatives. So there's different various, like, I guess, acronyms for this epidemic that's impacting Native communities. But as this panel is indicating, it's not just Native communities, Indigenous communities. It's different BIPOC communities where there's violence and gender violence happening across the board. And so when it comes to MMIP, I started this work when I was formally organizing with the Bears Ears National Monument narrative. I know when it comes to public lands or exploitation of lands for mining or drilling, like that narrative of like MMIW or MMIP was never really centered in the Bears Ears Monument narrative. And we tried to do that as a organization. And I feel like just being in that circle kind of put me on the front lines as far as like what needs to be addressed. And that's what it is. It's MMIP because it's like the precursor to like everything that exists around us today, like whether it's access to water, access to electricity, like it's like everything. You cannot ignore it. You can't say Bears Ears is protected without like, or sacred without the acknowledgement of this narrative that makes it like public land in Utah or public land in Nevada. And so I've kind of been around this narrative. I guess we grew up on it. Like, I don't think, sometimes I'm like, I'm a writer now, or I don't know. I don't like the word activist. I just feel like that's kind of who I am. It's just kind of like you're trying to shift and change the narrative and trying to dismantle some of these systemic issues or systems that create barriers in our own communities. But like currently in my role now with the Salt Lake Tribune, I'm trying to do my best to center and elevate Native narratives around MMIP, just because sometimes the audience and the conservative audience in Utah, probably similar to Nevada, does not really gauge why this topic is important. I know in public lands conversations are like, how's that related to Bears Ears? I'm like, it is obviously related. These are reasons why. And it sadly had to take like the pandemic, it had to take the Black Lives uprisings last spring or in 2020, and then just everything, like even to this day with the Supreme Court, like all of these are all interrelated in some ways. And so in the role of the Salt Lake Tribune as a Southern Utah reporter, not only am I talking about St. George's growth, but but just like talking about like, how do I make sure that growth is just not overshadowing narratives like MMIP. So I'm trying to elevate, and most recently I did write about the systemic issues, like the need, at least in tribal rural communities, like communities in San Juan County, Utah, in the Navajo Nation, the issue of jurisdiction, crimes, how that delays response times in those communities. But even if you zone in Salt Lake City, like it's in the top 10 for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, according to the Urban Indian Health Institute report from 2018 that said Utah is in the top 10, as well as the Salt Lake City. And so like, I've just been asked recently to like help elevate a narrative in the city. Whereas when I was writing with the Tribune on MMIG Day last Thursday, I profiled in advance as like, hey, editors, this day is coming up. Like, this needs to be told. I'll tell it in this way. And then now I'm like, okay, well, that was a rural community, but like, this is a Salt Lake City issue, a Wasatch Front issue. And so like, there's a, sadly, there's a case in which there's a story that hasn't been told publicly yet, but like, I'm working on that. And so in my role now is just trying to like, I did formally sit on a board with Restoring Ancestral Winds, and that's the organization that I more or less profile in the stories, but they're a nonprofit that is trying to end violence, domestic violence, sexual assault in Native communities across Utah's 8 sovereign nations.
Well, thank you, Alastair. I remember reading the story, that you broke about, those secret graveyards, and maybe you can cover it a little bit later. But I also wanted to know, when we're looking at the LGBTQ communities and our Native communities as well, we're suffering with greater rates of poverty. We suffer the stigma from, the colonial violence that has come about. And so it's so important to confront these issues. And how do you think we should be doing that?
I feel like, I think that's why I'm in this role again, because I was in advocacy and I felt like I was in advocacy and comms. And so like, when I was basically navigating advocacy and journalism, which is my interest, like I had issue with some of the media conversations or stories that were coming out. And I'm like, okay, well, my journalism career started with the Navajo Times. So that's how I started how I ended up with journalism and being in the Tribune now. And I felt like, well, I don't like the way the media has the pin and are not telling some of these stories that I feel like I need to tell. Now that I have the pin, I'm trying to like really tell these stories, including LGBTQ, queer, two-spirit voices in the Native community. And like, for instance, the Navajo Nation has a ban against gay marriage, or like they're calling it gay marriage. And so like, I'm working on a story to tell organizers there in the Navajo Nation, like help them tell them like why this colonial mindset of patriarchy and influences from the different sects of like churches that exist in the Navajo Nation infiltrate into our communities and create this patriarchy and toxic masculinity that I still, even to this day, like battle with my siblings or my father, or like, like I am having those conversations about like my identity and like, how do I exist in this society, or pre-contact, like how we did exist. And so it's a lot of like unraveling some of these brainwashed ideologies that have been passed down for centuries now, or hundreds of years. And so in my capacity as a journalist for the Tribune, I try to elevate and try to make sure that my presence is known, like whether it's through the writing, whether it's like, I like to dress well, I like fashion too, so I like to dress and look good. And then also just like just make it known that we're here and I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. And so you kind of have to more or less deal with who I am, like in my identity as a queer person, a queer gay guy, man, Diné man, and just having those conversations and just really like trying to like dismantle the violence. Of course, the data is out. in tribal communities, the data is not as relevant because we're also often categorized into a different racial group sometimes. And so I think when it comes to MMIP, including the LGBT community, it's underreported as far as cases. And then sometimes like depending on the case, and sadly in the case of a death, that's when, because we live on tribal trust lands most of the time, in rural communities like the Navajo Nation, the FBI comes in. And so like, it's that delayed response when lives could have been saved, and response and infrastructure and on and on and on. And so like, I feel like when it comes to LGBTQ communities and my identity, I just try to be transparent and accountable in what I do. And I feel like I do that with the accountability journalism right now that I'm doing.
Yeah, I really like that. I think there's a part that you talk about accounting journalism that is really important, but also media has been so responsible for, some of this violence that have been brought against our people, against Black people, and then people of color. And so I don't want you to, be holding all of that burden, but there has to be a shift in the way that media is working through these issues, how, they see murder that happens like within the Reno area. Anna Marie Scott, who, was found on February the 3rd in the trunk of a car. It was not even reported as a missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. And so how do you think that we can begin to see a shift in the responsibilities of the media to attend to those issues? And I hope that you will find some time to write a piece on Two-Spirit people.
Well,
and the
yeah,
value of Two-Spirit people.
I've done pieces on Two-Spirit people, and I've also done an op-ed where I like to farm, I like to grow foods. And so last summer I did submit an op-ed with World War Zero about how our identities are important to our communities, because in some cases, some of us know that old knowledge and wisdom that our sad, unfortunately, straight relatives forget. And then I do the same thing in my community, in my own family. I'm like, oh yeah, I read this. This is what culturally, this is what was like. So I'm kind of healing some of those gaps in knowledge, because we know that we're healers, we're medicine people, we're, I don't know, advocates, or we have many roles to play in our communities. And I mean, I can chop wood. I hate cooking. I don't like cooking at all. Or I can just do something masculine if I need to, or feminine if I need to. And I feel like that's the beauty of queer identity in Native communities, but all of the communities is we're kind of multifunctional. And I feel like sometimes we also have to reclaim some of these narratives that have that colonial influence mixed with cultural aspects. And you have to shed those things out and correct the narrative. And I feel like I do that now with my work in my own family network, but also in the reporting that I'm doing. And then when it comes to media, I think that's where I would hope that we would have the power to correct some of these misnarratives that exist out there. And I do that a lot with my editors. My editors are white. So I have those conversations. Sometimes they're kind of I feel like last week I had I'm not afraid to push back, because I push back quite a bit. And I'm for instance, one of my editors was why are we saying MMIWG Day when the White House is saying MMIP? I was well, it's the White House. We don't believe everything that comes out of the White House. And I said, in Utah, since you make it a Utah issue, it's first started as MMIWG Day, and that's how the movement started. So I would rather stick with that than say MMIP Day. So those are conversations I'm having behind the scenes when the story is being published. And it's a back and forth conversation that's always happening. So a lot of mainstream media, including the Salt Lake Tribune, definitely needs the sensitivity training that how to report in our communities. These are words that you need to say. And so for instance, I was on a breaking news desk this week. And so a missing man, a white man get missing in the mountains and in the Wasatch Front in Provo. And it was so interesting to see that they send like black helicopters and like men on horses and women on horses just to find him. And I'm like, where are these kind of sources available for people in our communities that go missing? So that was very interesting to see that difference, that 180 difference of missing cases in Utah, or probably like obviously elsewhere, but those are those discrepancies and disparities that obviously unfortunately exist in our communities. And so like I just try to do my best, and like I know like in the media realm too, there's that focus on data analytics, like ads, like, well, the readers are not engaged with this story, they're not like, so let's not write about that. And so like it's always a consistent battle where I'm still, I feel like I'm still an advocate, even though I'm not an advocate because I'm a journalist again. So those are microaggressions that I deal with when it comes to a mostly white management desk of like editors.
Well, thank you so much, Alastair. It's always good to hear from you. It's always good to hear your voice on the phone and your enthusiasm to, teach and always correct us on the things, on the better things that we should be thinking about. So thank you for all that you do and spending time with us today to have this important conversation. I will
Thank you.
send it over to Erika, my cohort with Plan.
Thank you so much, Bev. Thank you everybody for participating in the discussion. I'm going to facilitate the next piece with Jasmine. The next piece is really focused on femicidios, which is similar to the MMIP, MMIWG, really the missing and murder Indigenous women in this country, and a lot of the challenges that we're facing with that to be able to actually address the problem, and also the violence against Black women. Femicidios are heavily underreported as well in many Latin American countries, which is basically how they're able to track the killing of women based on their gender. In many cases, this is because the government would have to take accountability for also causing the mass murder of women in these countries. Examples of that are when armed conflict between rival gangs and cartels break out. Could also be between cartel and state actors, state policymakers. Oftentimes are heavily involved with cartels and gang rivalry. So all of those issues really impact why many of Latin American countries don't track femicidios. Another common one is also the violence that's committed by coyotes. Coyotes are people who help migrants cross the border. Oftentimes when coyotes are helping people, there's a lot of reports of people being left behind, women being raped, or essentially even killed by those coyotes, and then we no longer hear from them. So that's kind of what the femicidio conversation is, and why it also connects to MMIP and the violence that Black women face in this country. So I'm going to pass it over to Jasmine Margarita Tobon so she could share a little bit about herself, and then why these issues are so important to your community and the migrant community as a whole.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Bev. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Alastair. I am so always honored to be in a space with community leaders and people doing the work, right? Because that's what we're here for, is to learn about the work, to do the work. And I'm always open and receptive to learning as well, too. And so there said my name is, you can just call me Jazz, but I work as a community organizer and an activist. So you'll see me around and my pronouns are she, they, but I'm really here as a queer Latina fighting to end violence in our communities and the many and every hat that I wear. This subject, of course, is a difficult one because of my work with women, people who I identify as LGBTQ and migrants. My mother immigrated from Mexico, and so a lot of the context that we'll be sharing today is personal. And she's actually in Reno with me today because today's Mexicans, the Mexican Mother's Day. Guatemala and Belize also celebrates Dia de las Mamás today too. So shout out to anyone who might be celebrating it or have celebrated it this since Monday or Sunday. So yeah, this issue is personal because of the violence that the generations and my lineage personally has experienced and has passed down. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Can you share what femicidios mean to you and why this is impacting your community? Is this specifically attributed to intimate partner violence, or is there other reasons?
Yeah, absolutely. So femicidios is gender-based violence. That's just the clear definition of it. But femicidios, the fem in it is the femme people. So that includes trans women. And so some stats is just, it's approximated that 108 deaths occurred in 1 month of the pandemic in 2021. And in that year alone, 966 women were killed in Mexico during the partial lockdown. And it's important to recognize violence in all of its spectrum. And so this does include both sexual abuse and domestic violence. They're often greater after the outbreak of COVID-19 that confined people to their homes. And in some areas of Mexico, murders had fallen by 3.6%, but femicides had risen. And so speaking of the spectrum of violence, it includes inside of the home and outside. It includes intimate and non-intimate relationship-based violence. And so I think that this, and we'll talk about the context, I think, too, later, a little bit later, but yeah, and Laura touched on this too, like the intersections that I see clearly as I see Black trans women only having a life expectancy of 35 years old in the US. And Black and Latinx trans femmes have the most deaths. And it's important to recognize because of white supremacy, Latinidad, the thought process of like Latino America only looking a certain way, acceptable, often white, or a light brown at most, light colored eyes, something of the sort. It stomps out all of the indigeneity and African roots and descent and the different intersections that we have. And so again, trans women are women. And so gender-based violence increases with the more intersections that we see.
I think that's a great point. Thank you so much for bringing it up. I'm a queer undocumented woman living in this country, and I often see a lot of those intersections and how they, one intersection kind of adds more issues to your life. And I know that that's something that I've also heard from family members and friends who live in Mexico and the issues that they have to deal with being part of the LGBTQ community, but then not feeling fully supported by the broader Mexican community. I'm wondering, are women organizing for change across Latin American countries? Do you know of any of these? And is there a growing movement to fight against femicidios in Latin American countries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when violence hits our communities, I always see women leading the front of it. And I think that because of the hesitance among state policy makers to treat violence against women as a systemic problem, often in Latin American countries, the women take it directly to the state policymakers. They go straight to the courthouses. They go and riot, and whatever it takes, whatever means it takes in order to get their rights passed and find justice for their communities. And we've seen it happen across Latin America, but the Ni Una Menos, it basically says not one more, not one more woman to be killed, not one less, And I think it started in 2011. It was Mexican poet and activist Susana Chavez. She was assassinated, and everyone took to the streets. And since then, there's been different waves against violence in different countries. Like Argentina just had their 4th wave, and that was very much a grassroots movements led by women and led by queer people. But in the same movements, the same circles and whatnot, they're also fighting against sexual harassment, gender pay gap, abortion rights, sex workers and trans rights. So even in Latin America, right, it's a very intersectional movement. And I think it continues to grow, even though the press doesn't really pay attention to it, at least the American press. But I've also heard of regional movements as well. The Movimiento Estatal de Mujeres de Chihuahua, it's the state movement of women from Chihuahua, Mexico. It's Mexico's largest state, encompassing 3.7420 million people. I just Googled it like earlier today. So that was their population rate, and about half of that are women. And yeah, I mean, there's minimal justice for femicides, and even less for LGBTQ people in Mexico. And I think it's also really important because, right, we've worked in Nevada on mining justice, and I'm with you on the fight for Pihimaha, because green energy does not mean green when it's marred by the blood of Indigenous people and ancestors and their land. And I think it's really important to highlight how capitalism internationally, and we see it on the state and local level too, and how that hurts our communities. But for example, and I know that Plan has worked specifically with Guatemala industries as well. But Guatemala saw in 10 years, 2000 to 2010, over 5K women and girls murdered. And a lot of that was attributed to NAFTA open trade borders and maquiladoras. And that parallel to the mining industry is really important to understand that capitalism also kills.
Yeah, and that's a great point to bring up. It was when I first started at Plan, that was something that we were working closely with folks from Guatemala, and Raquel Cruz was our former board president. Her family's from Guatemala, and I spoke in great detail with her mom about some of the challenges that Indigenous communities there were facing because of mining industry. And the funny thing is that mining industry actually has their base in Reno, Nevada. It was Tahoe Resources. So they were operating in a different country on Indigenous land, exploiting labor of women and children while having their offices here in Nevada. So there's definitely that intersection and what continues to impact communities. I also just wanted to share really quickly two of my favorite organizations that are doing some of this work in Mexico as well. El Closet de Sor Juana, it's a feminist lesbian organization, and they work specifically on femicidios and uplifting the LGBTQ community through their work. There's also Las Hijas de Violencia, which is the Daughters of Violence, and they are actually a theater group. So they go around putting together theater songs, and then they have confetti guns that they go around and just like making noise and really bringing art and culture into their organizing and activism. So just wanted to share those two if folks want to look into them. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask one last question for Jasmine, and then we'll pass it over to Bev. How do you see religion or Catholicism specifically playing a role in the way that women or men are socialized, and what gender role might that socialization play in the epidemic of femicidios?
Yeah, this one's personal. I was on my way back, and just like a quick anecdote, and my mom and I went out to lunch, right? I took her out and I was asking her about this, and I was like, what do you think this is? Like, why does this happen? Why does this violence happen? And she was like, well, empieza adentro y con la familia. So what that means is that it happens inside of us and with the family. And religion is a construct, right? And religion tells us a narrative of what's sinful and not, what we should repent for and or not. And purity culture for women is very real and perpetuates the roles of servitude. So when women decide to not play in those roles and step outside of those roles, you're also stepping outside of your religion and out of your culture and out of your family. So there is many layers there. And so because you're stepping out, there's going to be forces for you to step back in. Alastair, you talked about brainwashing for centuries, and I see, right? Like, isn't that what Spain and Portugal Christianity did to indigenous communities across the country, like across Latin American countries, what is known as now. And I fight for and respect autonomy, and more respect than one. So please don't mistake this. This isn't to tell anyone to stop believing in their God. I believe in God. I am Catholic. But do I subscribe to every belief? No, because my work and what I do is closely tied to my own identity and really in opposition of the church. But I still find where my God and where my belief ends, it starts and ends. And I think that also we must find accountability in our communities, including the Catholic Church, for their violent role, like in boarding school and the Indigenous boarding schools. We must find that accountability to heal and to grow. And I don't think those things are mutually exclusive of each other at all. And you'll see that Latin American countries like Mexico and Argentina are largely Catholic, but they also decriminalize abortion. So it's really important to look at these intersections and these layers as a moving force that we can be accountable for and hopefully heal and grow to end violence in our communities. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much for sharing and sharing some personal thoughts as well. Being a queer woman, I know how difficult it is to be part of the Catholic Church and not know, like, where do you fit in? And I completely agree with you. I'm very spiritual and I go to church every once in a while, but it's a difficult relationship, but it shouldn't be something that, creates violence for other people. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'll pass it back to Bev so she can close us out. Or if there's any questions from participants.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for everyone attending this amazing conversation. If there's a area where we can educate a little bit more, I think it's to get a copy of this particular conversation that we had tonight and distribute it and make sure that all of the people that we're working with are watching this and really understanding exactly how we're showing up for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I think that's so important because I've learned a whole lot, and the people that are working on these issues are really, really centered in this work, and it's this type of healing that we're always looking for. But also, I wanted to shed some light on this particular work that we did, with the MMIW Solidarity Walk, where 250 people showed up last week here at on the Pyramid Lake Reservation, and signing the petition to oppose man camps at Thacker Pass. So that was really, really amazing to see, and also bring Native women to understand, all of these issues are related. And then we had the social powwow, the red dress social powwow, where close to 400 people attended. And we got another 200 signatures from that event on the petition. And so we want to make sure that we're dropping the petition link in the chat. Jackie, is that something that you can do from your area, or
Erika just did it.
Okay, so we're gonna acknowledge that, and so if you can just spend a few moments just filling that out, we'll probably stay open on the meeting for a few more minutes while everybody finishes that's kind of like the homework for what we're doing right now. But thank you so much for all of the people that showed up to raise the awareness and the education for missing and murdered Indigenous girls, relatives, Two-Spirit, and trans people. It was really, really meaningful to, come from that event and to feel so much strength from our community, the need to come together on this great night. It was really, really something. I felt I felt like it was really, really powerful, and I think we also have to embrace that spirit that we all bring to together, with song, dance, and healing, and also, the amount of gifts that were given, the acknowledgements of how we handle each other, when we lose a contest or when we, gain one, and how we have to be really respectful in community care and elder care. It was really important to see all of that. And then if there is anybody that has any questions, I think Jackie can see who's asking them. And then maybe we can answer maybe one or two questions. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.
I see a lot of thank yous. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for sharing your experiences, your wisdom, and your activism. We're very grateful. Like we said at the beginning, it's a lot goes on in this world that we don't know about because we're not there. And so we're very grateful to you for sharing that with us today. So thank you for that. And do we have any questions? I had one from the beginning, and it's very stupid. At the very beginning, Beverly, you said that crossing the medicine line.
Yeah, it's
I don't
really
know what that is.
through history, through colonial violence. There were areas that there's all of these different territories across the U.S. that Native people are very, very understanding of. They know where their territories are, and then they know whose territories begin from that particular area. So from here all the way to Golconda Summit is Paiute land, and once you pass to Golconda Summit, that's considered Western Shoshone area. It was really, really nice to hear from Mary Dan on American Outrage. She always knew exactly whose territory she was on, and she would say, well, if I went past this particular area, I knew that I was trespassing onto Paiute land. It was like really, really interesting how Native people always recognize that. But so in further north, when you have the Canadian border, and then the other border on the south by Nogales and all of that, there were areas where historical violence, this colonial violence, was pushing Native people into the north part of those lands. And so since there was, that military zone, it allowed Native people to run into those areas without any type of force. And so it was a safe space for them that they could just cross into those borders without any problem at all. But then these, like the Canadian mounted or the Canadian Rocky Mountain Mounted Police or something, weren't allowed to move south because they were being resisted by the American military. And so there are these safe spaces where Native people could go that allowed them to be safe and to be saved by these different type of territories, territorial lines, and then including what was happening in the south. So when we talk about north of the medicine line and the south of the medicine line, that's what those zones are for, really, really important safety zones for Indigenous people.
Thank you. Thank you so much for explaining that. So it's 7:04, and so I know that all of our speakers are very, very busy out saving the world. So we're going to go ahead and let them go. Thank you so much again for educating us today. Everyone is invited to join us in June, on June 14th, in celebration of Juneteenth. We're going to be talking about the illusion of inclusion from the lenses of community members, talking about systemic racism from lived and learned experiences. They're going to talk candidly about race-based trauma, healing of America in the new civil rights era, celebration of Black joy, rising to combat the traumas of racism. And as many of you said today, these are hard subjects, but they're things that we need. And so please come June 14th on Zoom and invite people to sign up, and we will see you then. And thank you so
Okay.
much, Beverly, for arranging this.
Thank you very much. Also, and then let us know where we're supposed to get a copy of tonight's discussions, because I think we really need to push it out a little bit further. I really enjoyed the education from everyone and the work that was put into this discussion. Thank you, Alastair.
Thank you. And we'll just watch our website and watch our social media pages for the recording.
Okay, and then follow Alastair on Instagram. All right, bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Donna. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, Laura.
Of course.